If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is the scariest, terrifying thing you have seen? A few years ago, I was driving back to my house from a friend's about 2 a.m. I was getting close to my house, in a really rural area with cornfields on both sides of the road. All of a sudden I saw stalks of corn blocking my path, going straight across the road from one field from another. Nobody is around, no cars, no houses, just my headlights shining on upright corn stalks standing across the road, as thick as the fields to either side. I knew I wasn't lost or anything. I drove home this way every day, and stopped the car on the road, just staring at the corn stalks trying to figure out what the f to do. After sitting there for a minute, I decided that staring at the corn waiting for something to happen was much scarier than doing something. So I hit the gas, hoping the corn would just fall down in front of my small car. It was one of the strangest feelings driving through the corn. I imagine it is what it would feel like to run through platform 9 3/4 for Harry Potter. 1 second I was staring at what seemed to be a solid field of corn, and the next my car is easily knocking the stalks over and I was through. The rows of corn across the road weren't as deep as I had thought, and in no time I was on the other side looking in the rear view mirror at a wall of corn with a now gaping hole in it. Went home, went to bed still freaked out. The next morning I went to leave, drove down the same road. And the only sign of the corn was a few stalks lying next to the road. I still have no idea how that happened. When I was around 6, my family lived out in the rural desert in Southern California near a Cahuilla tribe reservation. We had a few acre ranch that was beside small mountain, or large hill. My room had large windows that faced towards the mountainside, and as such, it was always extremely dark at night, so there was a motion sensor porch light that was attached over the back door which you could see from my window. Think of an L on its side. Back door lead to a room we never used, but anyone coming to the property thought it was the front door. Anyway, one night, while trying to sleep I hear a tapping on the window like a subtle scratching. I wake up and see 2 very striking yellow eyes and the silhouette of something at the window, very canine. Now we had coyotes here, but this was the size of a small man, far larger than any coyote, and there were no wolves in the region. We had a dog, but a border collie was nowhere near the size of this. So we stare at each other for a few moments, just dead still. I'm completely frozen on what to do while it just stares back. It begins to scratch again at the window, then turns and walks upright to the back door and tries the handle. The light goes on. See this furry dogman thing trying to get in, and I freak. Remember running out of my room and grab a rifle we had in case in the living room, like 15 feet away from my door, and then run back to my room. There it is, on the other side of the glass looking at me. It sees the rifle, then bolts into the dark. I never knew what it was, and I only learned about skinwalkers much later. Never told my parents, but I slept with that Winchester rifle beside my bed for a few years after. Backcountry camping alone can be incredibly scary. With a friend, you can at least discuss that bump you heard in the night, or you can be consoled that another will help you if something goes wrong. But alone, it is an entirely different story. The day goes by fine, you hike out, take a lunch break, get to camp, set stuff up / have a little fun. Then it starts to get dark. You have a fire and you can see a little at first, but before long, total darkness sets in. It is disheartening to not be able to see your hand in front of your face. Soon enough, you start hearing things, footsteps, twigs snapping, brush moving. Depending on where you are camping, you might hear coyotes / wolves at night. Coyotes have more of a shrill yelping howl, almost hyena-like. Wolves have this hauntingly beautiful droning howl. The worst part is that you will hear them everywhere. You'll hear a howl a couple miles away, then you'll hear one a mile away, then you'll hear one 500 yards away. Pretty soon, you can be surrounded by this eerie chorus. It doesn't make for the best sleep. Storms are also worrisome out in the middle of nowhere. Lightning has claimed many hikers. I also stumbled upon a black bear 20 feet away once. Despite nearly having a heart attack / shitting my pants / accepting death, it noticed me pretty quickly and fled. This happened just a couple weeks ago on a Friday. It was late at night, around midnight. I had 2 friends in my car. We were coming back from a restaurant to celebrate finishing up the school play. I just dropped the first friend off and was now making the 4 or 5 mile drive to my second friend's house. It's a narrow road in MA that cuts through some pretty dense woods. She was in the front seat and we were listening to ballads, just talking about life. Not a big deal. I was behind a deep red pickup truck that had a motorcycle in the bed of it the entire way so far. I wasn't tailgating them, nothing, even though the driver was going a bit slow for my tastes and swerving around just a tad too much. When I'm just about to reach this intersection that's not even a block from my second friend's house, this guy pulls over. Seemingly no reason, he just pulled over to the side of the road about a car or two's length from the blinking red light. As I pass him to stop up ahead, I see his face. He has a pretty generic face, nothing unusual, but he's staring right at us with anger in his eyes. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up and I just sense something's not quite right. My friend looks out the window and says, "What is he doing?" Shakily. I look at my rearview mirror to see the guy getting out of the seat, pulling a ski mask over his face and wielding a huge, I'd say 10-inch knife in his hand. He started sprinting at my car, almost reaching the passenger side. I screamed and slammed on the gas, driving around for a while, the man only chasing my car for a few blocks until he knew he wasn't going to catch us. When I got back at the intersection minutes later to drop my friend off, he was gone. My friend ran inside, locked her doors and everything, and I sped away, but it was terrifying. I told the police and filled out a report last week. Never driving at that intersection again. True story. My grandmother once lived in an old, 3-story house. It was set in the woods and slightly run down. It needed new paint, some of the floorboards would creak and the doorways were no longer straight from where the house had settled over the years. The house itself always gave me a slightly uneasy feeling. However, I have an overactive imagination, and at the time of this event I was heavily into my Stephen King horror phase. I was about 10. The third floor of the house contained 3 bedrooms. One bedroom belonged to my Aunt Beth, who was 8 years older than me and wanted very little to do with my brother or myself. Since we stayed at Granny's during the day while Mom and Dad worked, I think it was a jealousy thing. Beth was my mom's youngest sister and the baby of the family, while I was the first grandchild. About 3 months after they moved into this house, Beth started complaining about noises coming from the walls in her room that kept her up at night. Granny and Pawpaw dismissed her complaints, but when my other aunt who lived there began to echo her concerns, they decided to investigate. I was there when Granny took Beth upstairs and began searching her room, just to prove there was nothing there. The rat traps they'd sat hadn't worked and they owned 3 cats, so mice were not likely the culprit. Anyway, while moving a big dresser away from the wall, they discovered a piece of plywood nailed to the wall. It wasn't even painted. I should mention the dresser had come with the house, as had a lot of the furniture. Granny, being Granny, immediately took a hammer and crowbar and tore off the plywood. Behind it was a small door. I'm not kidding when I say small. It was about 3 feet high and narrow. An adult man would have to really squeeze to get in there. The door was locked, but Granny got it open anyhow. Inside was a little hallway, very dusty, that opened into a tiny room. I could walk in the hallway if I hunkered over. An adult would have to crawl, and could only sit in the little room. There was a small chair, doll-sized, in that room. Nothing else. The walls had been covered in wallpaper that was now very yellowed with age. Dust and cobwebs everywhere. I sneezed for days after this little adventure. What we finally noticed, and what still haunts me to this day, was the fresh-looking scratches on the walls of the tiny room and the little hallway. NT scratches, really, more like gouges in the wall. These gouges were in groups of 3, as if whatever clawed hand responsible had only 3 fingers. There was no dust in the gouges. They looked fresh. We backtracked out of that little room, not saying a word. Granny nailed the plywood back in place and moved the dresser back against the wall. And that was that. 2 nights later Beth moved into her sister's room and they kept that room locked until they moved out a year later. The house was eventually abandoned. I went back with a group of my friends in high school to show them the little room, but the stairs were in really bad shape and rotten. The house was torn down not long after. Years ago, I lived in a townhouse above an old couple that were the landlords. This was in the historic section of Albany, New York near the park. The landlords were in their 60s, maybe early 70s. This place actually had a plaque on the front of it saying it was built in 1880 something and that some rich state senator had lived there. There's places like this all over the area that had been subdivided and rented out. I lived there for a year, and every now and then, always while I was trying to sleep, I would hear faint, organ music accompanied by some rhythmic banging sounds. I always have slept with a fan to drown out any ambient noise and sleep better. This music was just floating through my room. No one was above me. Just the old people who went to bed at 9 below me. I would get up and try to find the source of the sounds, but it just seemed like it was everywhere and nowhere. Since I never heard any music or anything from any other room, and I never heard that music during the day, I concluded that it was the ghosts of previous occupants that had lived there decades before. This actually affected my decision to live there again when my lease was up. The old couple even offered to knock $50 a month off the rent if I resigned. That would have amounted to nearly a month of total rent over the course of a year. I thanked them, but declined, opting instead to live in a newer place. Flash forward a couple of years. My friend is having a party. He invites some coworkers that he used to work with at the state. I'm talking to one dude about all the places in Albany I had been in. He's lived in several, too. After some conversation, we find out that one of his friends used to live in that exact same apartment before me. I've never told anyone about the music and banging I would hear there, but I just have to ask this guy if his friend ever said anything about the place being haunted. His eyes light up when I ask him. "You're not going to believe this," he says, and starts thumbing through the contacts list in his phone. He dials his friend. When the guy answers, he gives him a brief overview of the conversation we had been having, then hands me the phone. "What's up, man? Yeah, I lived there in 2003. You heard the music, too? That was the landlords having sex below you. I swear to God. I actually asked about them about it the morning after I had heard it for the 10th time." The old man sheepishly explained that he was banging his old lady. He apologized and said they'd keep it down. The funny thing is, it seemed to get louder and louder over the last couple months I lived there. It was almost like they wanted me to hear. The mystery was solved. That organ music I had heard was literally organ music that the old people would have sex to. Somehow, that was creepier than it being ghosts. Growing up, I lived in the middle of the woods. No neighbors for about a mile on each side, and we owned 60 acres of forest, then a swamp after that. So basically I lived in the middle of nowhere. One summer when I was about 14, I was out in the middle of the woods playing with my dog. I'm an only child and both of my parents were out of town, when I kept feeling something hit my elbow. I'd go to throw Max's ball and the bump would make me throw it almost straight up. Assuming it was just me bumping it on trees or something, I ignored it. After the 4th or 5th time of it happening, I thought, well, this sucks, I'll just go home. Walking back, I felt uneasy, but I knew I was just freaking myself out because we were alone. About an hour later, Max and I are at home on the couch when the garage door opens and he starts barking. I hop up to go let in my mom or dad, even though they were home really early. I peered through the peephole and saw the door was still shut and no one was in the garage. Quieting Max down, I opened the door slowly and called out for my dad. Nothing. No response at all, so I go out to check the door and it's still locked. Okay. Sure. Weird, but oh well. Max heard it too, so at least I know I'm not crazy. About 20 minutes later, I hear the door open again, and this time Max starts growling like crazy. I quiet him down again and just assume it's the wind or something making noise, even though by this point my heart is racing. I hear footsteps come up the stairs and think, oh geez, Dad really is home this time, and hop up and run to the door. It starts to jiggle, so I run faster to let him in. I peep through the hole, and even though my hand is loosely around the jiggling handle, there's no one on the other side of the door. Terrified, I go hide on the couch with all the lights on. Max is still growling. About an hour after that, I start to feel a little better, even though I'm still terrified. Then I hear the door handle jiggle again. This time it was Max jiggling it. He needed to go outside, and the only way outside is through the garage. Fantastic. I literally sprint with him to the kennel, and as I'm standing in there, I decide to ask this thing questions to make myself feel better because I knew it wouldn't answer me. Thinking about what to ask it, my eyes are drawn to the huge heavy oak door on the kennel. It was always open because it was too heavy for me to move easily. I said, okay, ghost. If you're real, you'll shut this heavy door. Nothing. A minute goes by, nothing. Max is still sniffing around. I turn around to yell at him to hurry up, and then from behind me I hear click. I whipped around and saw the giant door had swung shut and latched. Okay, clearly it was just the wind. It wasn't really windy, but it was the wind, for sure, had to be. I proceed, okay, ghost, that was the wind. If you're really real, you'll open this massive door back up. Nothing. I relax a bit and then squat down with my head and on my knees, reminiscing about how lame I just was being scared when I hear click clack. The door was now wide open. Max was done, so we booked it back into the house, locking every door in the house. For the next 4 hours I would hear the footsteps on the stairs and the door handle jiggling every few minutes, until finally around 11 p.m. my dad walks in and yells at me for wasting electricity. I never told him or my mom about it until about 4 months later, when my dad came in from hunting after dark. He looked shaken and I asked him what was wrong. He said he aimed at 2 deer but missed both completely because it felt as if something was hitting his elbow and making him shoot way above the deer. That's when I told him everything. I never seemed to have much luck with commenting and the like, but nonetheless. Up until I was about 8 or so, I lived in a really old house that, since the beginning of time, had been bounced around from relative to relative until eventually my mother had been handed over the keys. It was basically a shit heap. 2 stories, a collapsed balcony on the second level, mold and mildew all over most of the ceilings, one tiny bathroom and the toilet was outside, overrun with frogs and spiders and whatever other kind of hellspawn the Australian outback would throw at us. I was terrified as a child, scared of basically everything. I'm much better now, and have much bigger balls than most of my friends, if I do say so myself. Nonetheless, I would probably have to put the blame on this old house of mine. I remember as a child that I would always have the same dream. I'd start in the kitchen, no idea how I got there of course. It was during the day, probably later in the afternoon. Nobody was around, so naturally I'd go looking for my mother and father. I'd go to all the normal places. Mom wasn't in the laundry shed or the lounge room, Dad wasn't on the patio outside or up the back at the chicken coop, and my sister wasn't around either. I was starting to get worried, thinking that everyone was gone and they'd left me alone. Until I heard a noise above me coming from the second floor, where the bedrooms are. Relieved, I darted towards the stairs and jumped on the first step. Then I felt it. There was something in the back of my head, making me stop, legs still raised up as I prepared to move on to the second step. Something telling me that I shouldn't go up there. Of course this thought was running rampant in my mind: don't go up there, don't go up there, stay down here, don't go up there, there's something up there. Finally my leg dropped before I could reconsider. I pushed myself up those stairs, and even though I didn't want to anymore, I couldn't stop myself, only slow down. Each step up was taken at an agonizingly slow pace, and I wanted so bad just to go back downstairs and find someone, run to my grandparents' house and stay with them until my mom was home. But eventually, I rounded the corner, leaving only the last few steps leading up to the floor ahead of me. There was nothing there, I couldn't see anything in the stairwell. I started getting hopeful at this point: maybe it's okay. Nobody's here. I was just imagining things, and it's going to be fine. I'm still taking the slow steps up when it appears. Something's there. I can't actually remember what it was, and I never could after I woke up. But it was horrifying beyond belief, and I would always try to close my eyes, because that was my thing as a child: if you can't see it, then it can't see you. But I could still see it. I couldn't blink, I couldn't shut my eyes, it was like my eyelids weren't working. I would even try holding my hands in front of my face, but still I couldn't block it out. I could see through my hands. And I couldn't do anything. I was frozen, unable to do anything except stare at this thing all but a meter away from me. Whatever I saw, whatever I did, for those 8 years I was at that house, I had to force myself up the stairs. Day or night, it was horrifying. My mother sighed and tried to reason with me, my father growled at me and called me a coward, and my sister just laughed and said I was retarded. But every time I had to go up those stairs, as soon as I hit the top stairwell, I had to stop and make sure that I could cover my eyes with my hands or that I could shut my eyes. Of course it would terrify me most when I'd go to blink and wave my hand in front of my face and it wouldn't work and I'd realize I was dreaming. I was once in a hot tub with some friends late at night, and we were all telling some stories. One of the guys told us this one, a story of a girl he knows, not sure if it's true, but multiple people in the hot tub who knew her verified it was true. So one day, this girl was called over to babysit. She did it a lot for these people, so it was routine for her. Anyways, she was told to put the kids to bed at 9, and she did. After she put them to bed, she started watching TV and doing homework, waiting for the parents to come home. But then, she started hearing some noises coming out of the basement, like pans falling and stuff. She just ignored it, and thought it was the washing machine or something. Anyways, a little later, she starts hearing the noises again. She decides to call the police, and tell them she was hearing noises coming out of the basement at the house she's babysitting at. The lady at the station told her there's a patroller in her area, and that he'll be at the house in about 20 minutes. Anyways, in about 5 minutes, she hears a knock on the door. She answers, and it's a full SWAT team. She asked, "I thought they were just sending a patroller." And one of the guys told her, "After you hung up the phone, we heard a second phone on the line hang up. Ended up there was a man in the basement, listening to the conversation. The lady in the station waited and heard him hang up, then immediately sent the SWAT team to help. They went downstairs and caught him. He was wanted for multiple cases of rape." One night when I was about 7 years old, I went to sleep at around 9:30 and got into the second level of my bunk bed. I soon fell asleep, but then I woke up in the middle of the night to someone whispering no, no repeatedly as if they were in pain, thinking I just imagined it. I tried to go back asleep. And then that's when I heard it, the creaking of the wooden boards on the stairs, slowly getting louder, and that whisper, "No, no." I knew it wasn't my parents because they were sleeping in the bed next to mine. Then I heard some screaming along with the footsteps coming up the stairs and again the whisper of "No, no." So I slowly got out of bed, crept towards the ladder to get to the floor, and I slowly began to crawl towards the bedroom door in the dark, which had a full view of the stairs. I opened it without creak in the darkness, and I saw nothing moving in the dark nook of the stairs. But I now heard the whisper of no coming from the room upstairs, which nobody used. I silently crept towards the stairs, but I kept the lights off, and I began to creep down them so I could check the front door. Nothing was out of place, so I turned on the living room lights, and that's when I saw it for an instant. The silhouettes of 3 people outside the living room window, and then they were gone. I proceeded to turn on every light in the house and crawl into bed with my parents as I waited for it to be morning. My parents were drug addicts. When I was young, we had a nice home, but slowly, as I matured, we started living in shittier homes. When I was a teenager, we rented a decent size, but rundown house in a weird neighborhood. On moving day, we set out exploring, excited to see that the unfinished basement at least had a semi-finished laundry room. Underneath the stairs in that laundry room, there were some childlike drawings on the walls. A picture of 5 family members, including a baby, with the caption "Our New Home." It was a little weird, but whatever kids draw in random fucking places, we just covered up the art and used the laundry room. That basement was super creepy. There was always a feeling of something watching you. All of us experienced some kind of weird thing in this house. Now, I believe in ghosts because of an earlier experience I've had in a much older house, but I still remain skeptical. Everyone who stayed with us or visited us reported hearing a voice of a little boy behind them at random times during the day. It was always the same thing, rah. The noise that little kids always make when they are trying to scare you. We all kind of ignored it, dismissed it, or lived with it. One day, I was home alone and sitting on the computer doing my online classwork, when I started to hear this weird buzzing noise. I ignored it for a while, but it just kept going, this steady buzzing noise. No one was home, even my dog was gone. I waited until my dad came home from work and fell asleep on the couch and decided to investigate. By then, the noise had been going for about 2 hours. I eventually followed the noise downstairs and saw my dad's electric hair clippers turned on and just buzzing all over the bathroom floor. I was really confused as to how this happened. I turned the clippers off and heard an impatient sigh come from the other side of the basement. Not thinking, I just said, "Sorry," and noped the fuck out of there. I got back upstairs and woke my dad up and told him he left his clippers on, hoping for an explanation. He told me he lost his clippers weeks ago and told me to go get them from the basement. The last thing that happened was something that really cemented the fact that there was something weird in that house in the minds of our whole family. My mother, brother, sister, and I were all getting ready to leave the house. Keys in hand, shoes on, and all of us walking towards the door. My brother stops at the fridge and says to us, "I'm going to take this last Pepsi, okay?" All of us heard from the basement, a distinctly childlike voice, I'd say a boy around 4 or 5, shout, "No," in direct response to this statement. It was so clear, it was that bratty toddler no that so many parents are familiar with. We all solemnly looked at each other, confirmed in each other's eyes what we just heard, and hurried to the car as naturally as possible. That is probably the only house I was happy to hear we got evicted from. Probably not creepy/scary in the way that you mean, but for me the first thing that popped into my head is the night that I called the police for the first time. Additionally, this story could be a bit triggering for some. I was 18, it was the fall after I had graduated from high school. I had been pining after these snow boots from Target for a few weeks and finally had enough to buy them. I'm weird. I got them, then went over to my friend's house with them on to show her. She lives directly across the street from me, so it's maybe a 30 seconds walk from door to door. I hung out over there for a while, then around 10:30 decided to go home since I had to take the bus to class early the next morning. It was trash night, so I went inside, grabbed a full bag, went out the garage door and took it to the curb. I heard some crunching in the leaves in my yard, but it was dark and I just figured it was an animal. I went back in for the recycling bin, and when I put that at the curb, a man approached me. He asked for directions to a nearby street, so I told him. He then leaned in and whispered in my ear, "I'm going to rape you." I took off running towards the house, tripped on my snow boots and fell in the garage. He was behind me, but I got inside and unlocked the interior garage door before he got to me. I heard him messing around in the garage. I ran upstairs and told my mom what happened. We called 911 and I spoke to the dispatcher while my mom found something that could be used as a weapon and went to see if he was still in the garage. He wasn't, so she closed the garage door, then we waited for the police. The officers drove around looking for him for a bit, then came to the house to talk to me. They didn't find him. About a week later I was on the bus and saw him. He looked right at me, but the way he acted was like he didn't recognize me. I called my friend to come meet me at the bus stop by the house and we walked back to her house and called the police again. They came out but still didn't find him. Probably one of the shittiest times of my life. Oh, and I threw the boots away. I couldn't wear them after that. I was standing in front of my house with my dad on a spring day when I was 7. We were looking across the street at the neighbor's house, making casual conversation to pass the time. Suddenly, we see about 3 crows start to circle around the house. Then, one of the crows dives into our neighbor's yard and starts to pull apart their storm drain, the water spout that catches roof water, and sends it to the ground. It appeared that a family of finches had built a nest in the drain and the crows wanted to eat the eggs. They succeeded. But that was not all. The crows then caught one of the finches, ripped its head off, and started to eat it. The other finch darted off in fright, abandoning its home. About 3 minutes later, I shit you not, the finch returns with about 50 other finches, and they start to attack the crows. The crows took down a couple more of the finches, but they were covered in a massive swarm of angry feathers. 2 of the crows were ripped to shreds within minutes, and the other one got away but fell to the ground after making it to a nearby hill, probably due to a damaged wing. It was very scary for my young mind, and I had just seen the horror movie The Birds. After everything was done, my dad turns to me and says, "What the fuck?" That was the first time I heard him swear. Last year I was staying in a vacation home with my family in St. Pete, Florida, right on the water. At the time my nephew was about 4.5. So it's like 10 p.m. and my nephew and I are swimming in the backyard pool. We only let him stay up this late because it was summer, and my parents and sister were off stealing plants. That's another story though. But we're swimming and suddenly my nephew gets this look of complete horror on his face and is staring out into the ocean. He starts tearing up and says the bone man is here. And I go, "What? What are you talking about, sweetie?" He goes, "Out there. The bone man is there. He wants to hurt us." I look out to the ocean and it's pretty dimly lit from the moon and see nothing. I go, "Where? Where do you see anything?" And he just points to the ocean and whispers, "Right there." Naturally I scoop him up, run inside, and lock all of the doors. Family comes home later and I tell them the story and they kind of laugh it off. 4 a.m. rolls around and my sister and I are watching Shark Week in the living room and my nephew is sleeping on the couch. He twitches, stands up, eyes still closed, and starts swaying back and forth. Full on paranormal activity style. I freak out. My sister tries to wake him up. When he opens his eyes he says, "He's outside." And passes out. Still get shivers thinking about it. Okay, I still get chills when I think about this, but here goes. It was a weekend night, a Saturday I think. I was home alone that night since my wife was out of town. So, I had the whole house to myself. I was cleaning up after a quick dinner I made and something outside the window above the sink caught my attention. I saw what appeared to be movement out of the corner of my eye. It startled me and I immediately stopped what I was doing and looked out the window, scanning for anything in the pitch black backyard. After a minute or two of trying to see anything through the dirty window, I cautiously went back to cleaning up. I honestly thought it might have been a big bird or something that flew past the window. No more than a minute or two later, the motion sensor light about my back patio turned on. Now this will only turn on if a large object passes in front of it. A bird will not trigger the light. I instantly grab the closest, largest knife I see and move slowly to the back door. I could still see the light from the motion sensor floodlight bleeding through the closed patio door curtains. I remember thinking at this point about whether I should quickly jerk the curtains completely open or try and peek through a slit. I chose the latter. So, without moving too fast or making a lot of noise, I peeked outside and initially I didn't see anything. However, after a moment I noticed something just out of reach of the floodlight. I couldn't completely make it out, but the color was grayish and had a curved shape. It was also moving slightly. The movement was almost like a rocking motion. I remember struggling to make sense of what it was. I was going through everything I could think of trying to explain it. I just couldn't make it out. I had never seen anything like it. As I'm standing there, peeking through the curtain at this thing, it stands up. What I was looking at the whole time appeared to have been its back as it was hunched over and squatting down on the ground. Okay, so at this point I'm ready to defend myself. I thought for sure this was some freak in my backyard and he's going to try and break in. Right then, with its back still to me, it slowly turns its head to look back in my direction. When I saw its face, I jumped back from the door in fear while making a not so manly sound. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. The split second I saw its face felt like 10 minutes. It had huge, dark reddish eyes. I mean huge. The eyes were way too big for its face, which was pretty much featureless and expressionless. As I backed away from the door trembling with the knife in my hand, I could now see a shadow through the curtains. This thing had come up to the door and was standing there. This thing was tall. It had to be at least as tall as me, 6'4", and it was still rocking back and forth, which very much unnerved me. At this point my heart was beating so hard that I actually thought a heart attack was imminent. I clutched the knife and yelled at the figure. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know it involved some threats and some cussing. Right then, the floodlight cut off. This in itself startled me for a second. I was still holding the knife but had stopped yelling. Everything was silent, except for my heart beating in my ears. However, it couldn't have been more than 10 seconds later when the floodlight turned back on. Which made me jump again. When I looked at the door, the shadow was no longer there, so I knew whatever it was had moved. I had a feeling it was still out there though. So, I crept up to the door again, completely expecting this thing to jump out of the shadows. I peeked through the curtains and into the backyard. I saw nothing in the light and couldn't make out anything beyond that. I remember staring for what seemed like hours, but was only a few minutes until the floodlight timer made the light turn off. After a little while of just standing in my kitchen holding a knife, I mustered a little courage and went outside with a flashlight to make sure it was gone. A few sweeps of the flashlight was all I could do before I slammed the door shut and locked it. I still don't know what I saw and honestly don't like thinking about it too much, as it just freaks me out. I suppose some would say it was a gray alien, but who knows? All I know is that I don't ever want to see it again, especially in my backyard. When I was in high school, we moved into a new house. Very quickly my older sister and I learned that there was no way of sneaking out of the house, as my mom's room was by the front door, the sliding glass doors were too loud, and the door leading into the garage, no matter how slowly, gently, you could always hear it open/shut. And with all tile floor and being as heavy-footed as I am, you could always hear me walk. Well, one night, I am laying in bed and just as I am about to fall asleep, I hear what sounds like someone running barefoot on the tile floor from the garage door, to my hallway, back to the garage door. But I never once heard the door open. I was frozen, like you see in the movies. It was so loud. It was a school night. And why would anyone be running? It's 12:30 at night. Then I thought maybe it was my little sister. But, that's not like her. Still frozen. Can't move. After about 15 minutes, I got up. And grabbed the nearest weapon of choice. My hairbrush. My older sister's room was next to mine at the end of the hallway, and I figured that would be the safest option, because I would have to cross over to get to my mom's room. And with the open layout, there was no sneaking if there was a murderer. Well, I went full force into my sister's door with the plan of barging it, but it was locked. After that recovery, I asked her why she was running in the hallway. She opened the door and said, "I thought that was you." She convinced me to run into my mom's room, where I found her and my little sister dead asleep. I finally got my mom to wake up. She called the cops because she thought it was one of the teenagers in the area. When they showed up, we went out the front door and were standing on the patio talking to the cop. The door was still open. In the midst of the conversation, someone or thing rings the doorbell. Then again, then a few times in a row, pauses, then multiple times in a row. Pauses. Then one more time. All of us stood there, half turned around with a WTF look on our face. The cop legitimately said, "I don't deal with paranormal shit." I thought he was joking, but when I turned around he was already getting into his car. I am forever convinced our house was haunted. Other incidents occurred, too, which makes me think this. 20 years ago, when I was 8 and living in San Diego, California at the time, my dad was in the Navy and we lived in military housing. I had an experience that has since made me develop a phobia of windows with no curtains or blinds of any sort shut at night. It was roughly 2 a.m., I was having a friend sleep over and my friend and I were playing with our Barbies in the living room. Now, the dining room and living room are basically just one big room. And on the wall in the dining room section, there were 3 floor-to-ceiling windows that had no blinds or curtains whatsoever. So anyone standing outside those dining room windows could easily watch whoever may be in the living room. And I felt like someone was watching us. I turned my head to the right, was greeted by a sight that I will always remember. It may not sound gruesome in description, but to an 8-year-old, there stood a man, a white man. I know this because he was wearing a dark blue, short-sleeved t-shirt that had a pocket on one side of the chest. So I was able to see his bare forearms, which were also quite hairy. He wore a black ski mask and black gloves. He had his face pressed up to the window with his hands on either side of his face to block out any glare from the street lights, watching us with such intent. I screamed my little 8-year-old head off and curled into a ball. My friend doing the same. Sobbing, she asked what were we to do. I said that we were going to count to 3 and run upstairs to get my dad. We began counting, but I only made it to 2 and I was hightailing it up those stairs. My friend was hot on my tail. We burst into my dad's room in hysterics, screaming about a man staring at us through the window. He didn't hesitate to jump out of bed and race out to the backyard, where the man would be standing. Of course, by the time my dad got there, the man was gone. Years later, I am retelling this account to my mom. My parents were divorced, but she lived in the area and remembers hearing about a rapist on the loose right about that time in that area. To this day, I am convinced that man was that rapist. About 3 years ago, I saw something that to this day I cannot explain. A mate and I had been drinking in our local pub. After closing time, he invited me back to his place to stay the night. Where I grew up is on the coast and quite rural, so it was about a 40-minute walk to his house, but only a 20-minute walk if we cut through a wooded area about 70 acres across. It was about 1 a.m., but we always crossed the woods at night, so even without flashlights we knew our way perfectly. It was summer and pretty warm, so about halfway across we stopped in a clearing and shared a joint. The clearing sloped quite steeply down a hill, and we were stood at the top edge looking down and out to sea, with the far edge less than about 100 yards away. The view from there is amazing. It was a lovely clear night, and it is a place we knew very well, but for some reason something did not feel right. Neither of us had spoken for about 5 minutes and I felt very uneasy. I sensed he felt the same, but being guys, neither of us was about to admit to feeling scared, so we just stood there peering into the trees and smoking in silence. That is when I saw it. A dim shape was moving through the trees on the other side of the clearing. It looked to be about 4 to 5 feet high. It did not seem to have a solid shape and gave off a dim silvery light that cast shadows across the clearing. The best way I can describe it is as a kind of glowing blob. It moved slowly towards us from inside the wood, but as it got to the edge of the tress it started to move around the edge of the clearing, all the time casting shadows and weaving in and out of the trees. I watched this, not breathing and frozen to the fucking spot for a good 20 seconds. I glanced over to my mate, and could see he was staring at the thing too. I could even see the shadows this thing was casting move across his face. After about another 10 seconds the thing just stopped, gave off a bright white flash, and just fucking shot up into the tree canopy crazy fast and just vanished. The whole thing had lasted about 30 seconds and the only noise was the wind in the trees. We stood in silence for another minute until I tugged on my mate's sleeve gesturing for us to move on. We carried on our journey in silence, not speaking a word to each other. I think neither of us wanted to acknowledge what we saw while still in the dark wood. We crept on. I was shitting my fucking pants, constantly listening and looking all around me. I had no idea what I had just seen, where it had gone, or even if I had really seen it. After a tense and silent 10-minute walk we had reached the other side, and as soon as we were back on the well-lit road we looked at each other's pale faces and tried to figure out what the fuck we had just seen. My mate told me he had seen exactly the same thing but had not been able to tell if I had seen it too. Both of us had felt horribly uncomfortable the second we arrived in the clearing, a place we had been hundreds of times before and never felt anything out of the ordinary. We did not sleep that night. We sat up trying to explain what we had seen. To this day neither us can even guess what it was we saw, and I no longer cut through the woods at night.